Welcome back to the weird and the wonderful with Strange Bones. That's me. And of course, as we get going on this, we are following on at a kind of a general theme. Welcome there to Spookies and Jen. Awesome to see you guys on. And we are following our theme of, well, how can we put it? Well, it started with survival in real life, and especially for civilians, and it led on to a number of questions that came out of that. What could possibly actually happen in real life? What are the strange and different things that are out there? And this led to a question on two topics which we're going to start at least on tonight. Spooky, how are you doing?
Hi, good evening.
Are you good, sir?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. So yeah, tonight we are going to be looking at two of our topics, and both of which came out of all of our conversations about survival and a generalized apocalypse and all the rest of it. And that's going to be two sides of a very creepy thing, because it's based in real life. As we mentioned at the end of the last live, is Fallout really that realistic in any manner or form with all the mutations? Are these kind of mutations possible? What is the real science behind mutations? And with that said, what real human experiments have ever been done, and by whom? And the weird thing is, it's not just the ones you think of. So I think it's going to be a suitably interesting live, but it's going to be a fairly creepy one, because some of those experiments are pretty dark. So if you're interested in all of that, stick around. But if you are faint of heart, this might not be the live for you tonight, because some of these things got really, really odd. And it does go to show that scientists in general should not be left unsupervised. Just throwing it out there. So,
We're going to talk about DARPA.
About which one? DARPA?
Yes.
I
You
had
don't think DARPA tries to mutate soldiers, or the Chinese or Russians? They've
okay.
got labs which nobody knows of because it's unethical to practice these type of mutations on people. That people do mutate things. Plants get mutated, animals get mutated, but because of ethics, people don't really use other people as test subjects.
Okay. Well, I have a
Well,
little
there's documents
bit.
from DARPA about trying to make mutated soldiers, but nobody's really supposed to know about
I'm. I have a small collection of DARPA experiments. Some of them are not too bad. Some of them even seem reasonable. Some of them I do worry about a little bit. So we will get to them. But to begin, because after all, it's going to be an interesting one. Let's at least begin with where our mind began, so to speak. But to begin it, of course, remember everybody that on this channel we have one rule only, which is at the very least, be polite. You're allowed to agree, you're allowed to disagree. Your comments are absolutely requested, not just encouraged, as long as you're polite about it. Politeness is a fundamental requirement. That said, like, share, subscribe, do all of those good things, send lots of gifts, keep the channel going, and let's begin. So this is where the rabbit hole began. So we were talking survival and what would happen after a worldwide event that really sent the world down to the barest minimum. We had to restart, and we were talking about all of the things that could have caused such a thing. We mainly were discussing, just because you had to pick one, what if zombies, but one of the things that obviously is quite a big deal is what if a nuclear event occurred? Because as we know, that is a very real possibility. And of course, it is the topic, if you will, of the hugely popular Fallout games. So in Fallout, we know that there's a lot of mutations and strange things like that, which may or may not terrify. And Spooky and I were talking about them, and they are absolutely very interesting. So here are a couple. Now, we know one of the most important mutation events in Fallout is what they refer to as the FEV virus, the forced evolutionary virus that create the super soldiers, the super mutants and all of that, which evidently went very badly wrong for most of the Fallout universe. But is such a thing possible? Well, radiation exposure in the Fallout games created two specific things. You had the super mutants and you had the ghouls. Now, in real life, random DNA damage from ionizing radiation or natural genetic drift is unlikely to cause a super mutant type event, they say. It's more likely to make you very, very ill and you just won't survive it, rather than making you into something else. But in all fairness, we're not entirely certain. Dramatic physical changes like extra limbs, size increase, altered skin, unique abilities, greatly extended lifespans, that seems unlikely. However, as we will see later, genetic coding might be a different story, but not from radiation. Most significant from mutations from radiations are lethal, or if not lethal, cause cancer, sterility, birth defects. Are there any beneficial? No. Hello, how are you doing?
Okay, thanks, and you?
Good. So we're running with a combination of the idea of genetic mutation and actual experimentation, which you brought up, which is far creepier actually than your Fallout style mutations. Be warned, this may be dark. So yeah, it seems that real mutations, at least large scale, not small scale, will require quite a few generations to develop and are not likely to occur in a single generation, like within their lifespan. Now, the Ghouls, for example, in Fallout, humans who survive high radiation are left with decaying but functional bodies and practical immortality. In real life, you
I'll be back
don't
in
get
2
it.
minutes.
All good, all good. You don't get to be immortal. You do get to look very briefly like a ghou, but you're not going to make it very long. So that, it seems, is not likely. Now, what about giant creatures? You know, you have your red roaches and other giant animals, death claws and so on, that grow to huge sizes and even establish stable populations. Well, a thing called the square cube law, which no, I had never heard of before, makes giant insects impossible to sustain. Large-scale animals would struggle to find enough food in a wasteland environment. I'm not certain if that's entirely true, especially if you think that if they're that big and that dangerous. I can think of one species that would be an abundant food source, and unfortunately we're it. So maybe, yeah. You look a bit worried about that. Are you thinking of the idea
Yeah,
of giant
I'm thinking.
cockroaches?
No, it's a bit creepy. The
It
thought.
is a bit creepy. I did warn you. Can you imagine a 2-foot-long cockroach wandering through your house? I think that would put me right off. So it
Yeah.
seems that by and large they think it's unlikely. Now, in Fallout, you can cure radiation damage with simple medication and even regenerate limb damage with certain things. In real life, DNA damage by radiation is irreparable. Once you've got it, there's no fixing. So it would seem that real world versus Fallout is not realistic. Testing that was done around Chernobyl and Fukushima show that nature actually is very resilient and recovers very quickly. And animals seem to remain fairly physically normal, though you might get some genetic defect, but they're mostly small things and they don't turn into mutant hell beasts. At least they say they don't. Hopefully they're right in that regard. But you might get color changes and things like that. It seems that the biggest, shall we say, danger of mutation is not from a Fallout type scene at all, but instead might actually be from a different angle. Now, Fallout obviously blends plausible science with deliberate fiction to make a pretty cool game, and now movies.
Oh, are we talking about a game? I was trying to figure it out.
Yeah, well,
Fallout.
Fallout. Have you not played Fallout?
No.
Okay, I thought you were a gamer girl. Good grief,
I
Nikki.
am, but not
No,
that
you
type of
you
games.
need to play Fallout. It is one of the best games you will ever play. If you like Skyrim, you will love Fallout. Yeah, absolutely. But it's set in a nuclear wasteland, post-apocalyptic, and which is how we got onto it. Now,
Oh, I see.
yes. Now, there are certain accuracies in it, in that the amount of devastation that the nuclear weapons caused, the radiation and all of that, but it is kind of simplified quite a lot to make it gameable. So it's unlikely we will ever have a Fallout universe thing. If we were to ever have weird mutations and all of that, the creepy part is they were more likely to come from human experimentation. Now, have humans ever done such experimentation? Well, the answer is yes. And some of their experiments have been really, really weird. Now, on the most basic level, and probably the almost most normal level, we know that scientists absolutely do experiments on diseases and all of that. Mostly, I would hope, in order to find cures, vaccines, all of that kind of stuff. We know that happens, and indeed, it's been effective. You've probably, especially if you were from my generation, you've got this funny little round scar on your arm,
Oh, yeah.
which is your smallpox thingy. That literally came from experimentation on the smallpox disease to find a cure. And great, because smallpox was deadly. Almost always. It was a terrible disease. And a smallpox outbreak could cause terrible amounts of damage. Now it's virtually non-existent, which is great. That's the good side. However, let's talk
Children
about...
get a bunch of vaccines.
Yes, we do, all the time. And they work, for the most part. I know there was a huge amount of conspiracy theory, some of which may or may not have reason for, about the coronavirus vaccine. I do wonder whether or not some of the vaccines aren't done to promote a bit of money, more than anything. So,
Or maybe war in certain countries.
well, again, but there is no proof of any of that. So we won't go there yet. But let's talk about some experiments that really, really were done, some of which they're on the other side of distasteful. Just saying. Now, let's talk about certain ethically controversial experiments. So the first one up was done in the 1960s, and it was called the Milgram experiment, after the psychologist Stanley Milgram, and it was a test to see how obedient you are. Now, what they did, which is really freaky, is they got a group of unknowing test subjects, okay, who were told one thing. Now, the test subject that they thought was the test subject was someone else. They didn't realize that they were the test subjects. So the apparent test subject was actually an actor pretending. But the people doing the test were told that every time that they pressed a certain button, an electric shock would be given to the test subject. And it would get increasingly more painful until it reached a point at which it could become lethal. Okay? So it started with a mild buzz and got worse and worse and worse and worse. Now, they didn't know that the guy was an actor. They really believed that they were doing this. And they were instructed over a period of time to keep pressing the button to see at what point they would stop and just say, listen, hold on, you know, I can't just keep hurting somebody.
Yeah.
But here's the nasty part. Up to 65% of the participants delivered the maximum volt shock, despite the learner screaming and eventually going dead silent, proving that people will do as they're told against all ethics. So they literally believed, Shady, hey, they literally believed that they had gotten to the point where they had offed the so-called test subject. But they were like, but you told me to. 65% of humanity. That tells you a little bit about human beings, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And that's not the worst experiment. Now, I'm sure all of you have probably heard of the Nazi experiments on humans, and yes, they did happen. But most of the things that they did, they were not the first ones to do. So, for example, as we know in South Africa, the terrible stories of the Nazi concentration camps and all the rest of that. But do you know who first used concentration camps and on whom?
The British.
The British it was. And it was on South Africans, Afrikaner women and children, long before the Germans. And it was deliberate. So, too many pointy fingers at the Germans. The British did it first. Who were among the first to do human experiments? Well, the Swiss, the people who are supposed to be the best human rights people in the world. No, they're not. A great many experiments, far worse than the Nazis ever did, were done in the US. And for varying reasons. So we're going to
I'm going to
look
say
at...
you're wrong.
Okay, go for it.
Well, I'm going to say about 10,000 years they tried and experimented it on a guy. He got a wound, so they threw mud on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
There is a certain truth to what you're saying. I think by and large humans have experimented on each other's and on themselves for centuries. But deliberate for this is science and we're doing it deliberately. It's generally not the way we think. So the next interesting one was the Stanford Prison experiment, which was as recent as 1971. And yes, it was in Stanford Prison. And they got a group of ordinary people, just casual, hey Oreo, just casual people, and then they divided them into two groups. One group was told, you are prisoners, and they were given prison uniforms. Manice Volker would like to join as a guest. Shall we let them? Quick vote. Yes, no? No?
Very common.
Yeah.
I don't know who they are, so...
If they didn't comment, let them comment first.
Yes, I think so. Okay, so the Stanford prison divided two groups. One group was said, you are now guards. And the other group, you are now prisoners. Now, they gave the guards very carefully chosen uniforms, so it was very hard to tell them apart. So they became almost anonymous. And then they put them in a prison and said, you're going to live for a couple of weeks just as normal people in a normal prison. And you will treat the prisoners as you ought to. They go into the cells at certain times, they come out for meals, they get exercise in the yard and all the rest, just like a prison. But it quickly became a devolution into abuse and forced control, where the guard people, even though these are all ordinary people and they knew that the prisoners were just other ordinary people, were subjected to control and dominance from those assigned the roles of guard, showing that if you put people into a system, they fit themselves to the system and how they fundamentally believe a system should go, even if they know it's not real. Which again shows you something about human mentality. So the psychological experiments are pretty weird. Nevertheless, it gets worse. And this next one we are going into a lot more, so I'll just give you a brief overview. 1950s and the attempt to pioneer organ transplant type thing had two-headed dogs. There's a frightening thought. There were also the demon core experiments of the 1940s, where realizing that radiation and a radioactive core, as used in a power plant, can go critical, they wanted to see how close you can get before it does. And they pushed it until it did go critical. And in fact, the scientists involved, Harry Douglin and Louis Slotin, literally gave themselves a massive lethal dose of radiation and a couple of weeks later passed away. So scientists will push the envelope. But now, how far can you get weird? Well, let's first talk about some weird but actually safe scientific experiments. Hello, sire, to Gerard Scarp, the man that actually started this whole channel. If it was not for him, I would not do this. It was his encouragement. So yeah, it's always good to see him on. He doesn't always get a chance, but it's great to have him here. So the first one was a pitch drop experiment in 1927. Now, pitch is assumed to be a solid. And if you whack it with a hammer, it shatters like glass. But weirdly enough, and like glass, it's a liquid. And very, 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 very slowly, it will drip like glass. Now, if you ever go to one of the really, really, really old castles in Europe, and you look at the windows, the stained glass in the windows has actually started to pool at the bottom, weirdly enough.
That's cool.
It is very cool. Now, they did it with pitch, which is a tar-like substance, in Australia, in the University of Queensland. It is still going on, and it has been going since 1927. And slowly, it has managed to drip in nearly a century only 9 times. That's how viscous it is. So, not everything is what you think it is, despite all. Next interesting one is the spiderweb drug test. Now, what they did is they realized that spiders make really pretty webs. And they do. And if you go and check a spider's web, they are generally amazingly accurate. They're really cool. But what happens if you give the spider LSD? Genuinely done. So they gave different spiders either marijuana, cocaine, caffeine, or LSD, and watched to see what kind of web they would spin. And sometimes these webs were just crazy because the spider was off its rocker. So yeah, that was 1995, very recent. Then you had the daddy shortlegs mutation. So they discovered a specific gene in the common daddy longlegs, the spider, which created a stunted food manipulating appendage instead of long legs. And they were doing it quite literally to see how different genes act and what happens if you poke them. Now, this is very important for later things we will discuss. Some good, some not so good. Because if I can manipulate the genes of a spider, what other genes can I manipulate? Now, we also know, yes, this is leading up to things, mosquitoes and Skrillex. A study in 2019 found that female mosquitoes don't suck blood or mate when exposed to the dubstep song Scary Monsters and Nice Sprites by Skrillex, suggesting that certain music might create an environmentally friendly alternative to insecticides. And I hate to say it, but all I read when I saw this was everybody hates dubstep, even insects.
Yeah, for sure.
But there you go. If you play this particular song, the mosquitoes won't bite. How about that? Now, of course, those were the nice ones, and not the ones we are here to discuss, of course. But it shows you that people do start. Now, as I said, the Nazi medical experiments were pretty harsh. They were conducted on prisoners in concentration camps like Auschwitz. They involved horrific and very often fatal procedures under the guise of military and racial advancement. Hypothermia studies, where basically I would take a person, strip them naked, dip them in ice water, and then leave them there and see how long you can survive. Yeah, Scarpy, you must try it. Apparently, it really works. And this was a scientific explanation. But yes, they would see, because what they were trying to do was find ways to make it safer for their soldiers. So at what point does your body start to fail in freezing situations? And at what point is it fatal? They also did high altitude decompression and the intentional infection of wounds to test drugs like sulfonamide. Now, sulfonamide really does work. It's an amazing and pretty easy to use anti-infection drug, and you can put it directly into a wound. So on one hand, it was great, wonderful. However, their means of testing it was not so great. But they were not the only ones. They might be the ones blamed for it, but they were not the only ones. So in Japan, you had Unit 731, the Imperial Japanese Army Research Center for Biological and Chemical Warfare, to be tested on human subjects, mostly Chinese civilians and prisoners of war in occupied Manchuria. Victims exposed to infectious diseases like anthrax, cholera, the bubonic plague, typhus, including vivisection on conscious individuals, and the intentional spread of plague-infected fleas across cities, which resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths. The idea of using animal biological warfare, which is still being tested in certain ways. The possibility that I could somehow design a drug or disease into mosquitoes and release them in a country is certainly being looked into. I don't care what anyone says. I mean,
Definitely.
let's be realists. Now, what about the US? The great defenders. Well, between 1932 and 1970, the United States Public Health Service observed the progression of untreated syphilis in 399 African American men in Alabama who were not informed of their diagnosis and were deliberately denied treatment, even after penicillin was widely available as a cure. The study led to a lot of death and long-term health consequences, and the subjects never knew. It was all done in the name of science by the US Health Department. There was also the Guatemala syphilis study between 46 and 48, where the US government researchers intentionally infected approximately 1,500 Guatemalan individuals, including mental health patients and soldiers, with both syphilis and gonorrhea to test prevention methods, all without informing them or their consent. But don't worry, it's okay, because in 2010 they did give an official apology.
Right.
Right? I'm sure that it made everybody feel a lot better.
Yeah.
Then you have the Milgram shock experiment that we talked about, the Monster study. Monster study is good. 1939, University of Iowa experiment, where orphan children, some of whom did not stutter, were subjected to deliberate negative reinforcement and criticism regarding their speech to see if stuttering could be induced. The study resulted in significant psychological harm, self-esteem issues and anxiety, even and to the non-stuttering and healthy children. So they did this on children.
That's
Scientists, dangerous people. Now, we've already spoken in a previous live briefly about MK Ultra. So during the Cold War, the US CIA conducted covert mind control experiments. Now, they wanted to use them, possibly on the enemy, but first they had to test them. So they did it on unsuspecting citizens, using drugs like LSD, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and electric shock in an attempt to develop techniques for interrogation and psychological manipulation. So, you know, it's meant for the enemy, but we're trying it on you first. Now, how good is that? Yeah, I'm going to argue that that might not be a good excuse. I mean, at least the Nazis did it on the enemy. You know?
Yeah.
I'm just throwing it out there. When you're doing it on your own, that's pushing things a little far.
Yeah.
So, now we've got two more people that have asked. There's JD and Franklin Daniels, and I don't know either of them. Guys, I'm going to say sorry, because we generally only allow people on the live that we know, because we've had way too many trolls, and some of them have been fairly nasty. So you have to have been on, commented a few times, and we've got to know you. Just saying. So no offense, but okay, let's talk about the zombie dog experiments. Yes, this is awful. This was done in Russia in the 1940s, where Soviet scientists managed to keep the severed heads of dogs alive using artificial blood circulation system. The dogs responded to stimuli, did try and eat, though obviously couldn't take in food because they had no body to take it in, but it went in the mouth and out the esophagus, and blinked and reacted to lights and all the rest of it. And they were just a head that stayed alive. Now, we will talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but that was as recent as 2005, when the US repeated the experiments. So back in the bad old days, the Soviets did it. Well, in the modern days, the US did the same thing. Just saying. Then you had the experiment on enslaved women. So J. Marion Sims, known as the father of modern gynecology, who is lauded for his amazing studies and incredible successes, started his career performing his experimental surgeries on black slave women, mid-1800s. And the entire idea was to see if you can treat vesico-vaginal fistulas and things like that. But because they were just slaves, and because, as everybody knew apparently, black people don't feel pain, they were all surgeries done without anesthesia because you didn't need it. Yeah. So, yes, not the nicest things ever. Now, how weird can we get? Well, one way we can get very, very weird, that scientists have really gone off the rails, was when they created glow-in-the-dark rabbits. And I will give you a picture, if I can put it up, of glow-in-the-dark rabbits. Because after all, why wouldn't you want glow-in-the-dark rabbits? I've just got to, 1 second, pop it into the correct format. So give me 2 seconds to bring it up. And this is a real picture of one of the ones that they did, apparently. Get you. Dum 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 dum. Plink. Save you. And we're getting there. I'm terribly slow on the computer. I'm not going to lie. That's because I'm a little bit stupid. But you have to bear with me. But there we go. This is a glow-in-the-dark rabbit that scientists made. Now you might ask, why? Why? Well, the answer is for a number of reasons. What they did was take jellyfish DNA, because as you know, jellyfish do fluoresce. They are glow-in-the-dark in many cases. And they spliced it into a rabbit's DNA with an idea that can we modify DNA with the potential for future things for humans, of course. So it was injected into the rabbit embryo and then implanted it into a mother rabbit, and the result was a successfully glowing rabbit. Now, you do have to expose it to a special black light for it to glow. But it proves that genetic engineering absolutely does work, and that you could possibly then manipulate other genetics to force beneficial effects or proteins, which might mean we can find ways to make you immune to certain diseases. It's a theory. Huge thanks to Gerard Scarp for those roses. I absolutely appreciate that. And for all the guys who have sent a whole lot of likes, I appreciate. But they've gone a little bit overboard at times. And here are 5 more experiments where it didn't destroy the world, but not for lack of trying. The Kola Super Deep borehole. Now, basically, they wanted to do a borehole in the Arctic Circle in 1970 to see how deep they could go. And they only stopped boring in 1989. So 19 years, reaching a depth of over 12,000 meters. And it went a third of the way through the Baltic continental crust. Now, not planet threatening as it turned out, but they didn't know that until they did it. And they did manage to get some very interesting analysis of rocks from more than 2.5 billion years ago. Now, some people said that if they did it, they would release demons from hell, or that they would cause some kind of terrible explosion. Luckily, they didn't. They did discover large amounts of hydrogen that made the mud boil. It was apparently a typical Cold War project that the US held the world record for until this particular one. They had managed to get down to 9,500 meters in Washita County in Oklahoma. But really, should you be doing things like this? Apparently scientists think you should. There was also the Trinity test, which, as we know, I'm not going to say that this wasn't dangerous. But they say that the test itself was safe. And this was the first nuclear bomb detonated in the desert of New Mexico. Accumulation of relentless efforts by a team of American and European scientists to create a weapon of mass destruction capable of deterring the Nazis and possibly the Japanese, and possibly in future the Russians. Initial fears were that the detonation would ignite the atmosphere, and that's what didn't happen. Yay! However, it was still a massive nuclear explosion, and they then went ahead and dropped bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima and the Bikini Islands and because, well, you know, you can. But it was a safe experiment, not a safe result, but, you know.
Well, that's the biggest reason why we don't really continue with trying to mutate people for survival reasons, because the mutation often goes wrong.
Yes. And we are going to get further into that as well, and where they are going to try it anyway. Now, the next interesting one was in 1962, which was Starfish Prime, where they detonated a large nuclear bomb, the US, at an altitude of 250 miles to see if you can disrupt missile systems. Again, Cold War. The detonation could be seen 900 miles away, and a radiation belt was created around Earth that lasted for 5 years, affecting low-orbit satellites. No planetary cataclysm should have been feared, but they weren't certain. As it turned out, it didn't happen, but really, destruction testing the Earth?
Yeah, so crazy.
And then, of course, you had SETI, where they've been looking for alien civilizations for about 5 decades. Now, the other possibility, what if aliens do exist, are more advanced, and are hostile? Should we be calling out to them?
Probably not.
Probably not. Now, they haven't yet succeeded, as far as we know. Obviously, conspiracy theories says otherwise, but as far as we know, there's been no contact. Maybe we should stop, just for safety.
Yeah.
You know? guys, really? Maybe not. Now we're getting on to the more bizarre and the more interesting, where we know that they gave spiders LSD, but what happens if they give an elephant LSD? And a bunch of researchers in Oklahoma City decided, let's do it. So they loaded up some LSD into a syringe that you could fire from a dart gun, and they shot it into Tusco, the elephant, to see what would happen. Now, 297 milligrams of LSD is about 3,000 times the level of a typical human dose. It remains the largest dose that we know of ever given to a living creature. The researchers figured that if they were going to give an elephant LSD, they better not give him too little, because elephants are quite resistant to a number of drugs. So a couple of scientists got together and they want to see if they could basically, and in ordinary human language, cause the elephant to go horny. Now, the problem is, when this happens, it's called musts, and it's a temporary madness that male elephants exhibit, where they go very aggressive but also highly sexual and run off to mates. So can they induce it? Now, there's a certain amount of ghoulish curiosity that must have been involved more than science. Now, whatever the reason, it immediately and unsurprisingly went wrong. He reacted as if a bee had stung him. He made a noise and ran around his pen for a couple of minutes and then fell over on his side. They tried to revive him with antipsychotics, but an hour later he was dead. So it seems that elephants are sensitive to LSD. Sorry.
Not so bad.
Right? I mean, why? But then we know the same scientists also gave LSD to humans to test that as well. So why not an elephant? You know, if you're going to test things. Now, they then started arguing whether it was the LSD or the antipsychotics that they gave to revive him knocked him off. So 20 years later, another scientist decided to settle the debate, and he gave another dose, mixing the drug into their water, and administered in this way, they not only survived, but didn't seem too upset at all. They were a bit sluggish and rocked back and forth, made some strange vocalizations like chirping and squeaking, and then after a few hours were back to normal. He did admit that it's possible that the original dose given to the first element might have exceeded the threshold of toxicity, but it seems that they enjoyed it. Why? Really, people?
Crazy.
Now, what about Vladimir Demikov? In 1954, he shocked the world by unveiling a surgically created monstrosity, a two-headed dog. He created the creature in a lab on the outskirts of Moscow, grafting the head and shoulders and front legs of a dog, a puppy actually, onto the neck of a mature German shepherd. Demikov paraded the dog around the world. Journalists attended, and both heads were able to drink milk. But unfortunately, the puppy's head didn't have a connected esophagus, so the milk just dribbled out. The Soviet Union boasted the dog was proof of their nation's medical preeminence. Over the course of the next 15 years, Demikov created a total of 20 two-headed dogs. None of them actually lived very long, and most had serious tissue rejection problems. The record was a month. Now, Demikov explained that the dogs were part of a continuing series of experiments in surgery, ultimately with the idea of how to perform a human heart transplant. Unfortunately, he was beaten to it in 1967 by Dr. Christian Barnard, who not only did it correctly, he actually saved the patient.
Yeah.
Throwing it out there, there's ways to do things better.
Yeah.
Now, here's one that will upset everybody. Can you ungay a person? This is a question. So, they took in
Yes, you
1954.
You tell him you're going to throw him off a building.
Well, that would probably be the nicer way of doing it. What they did, two people from a university in America found the part of the brain that causes you to feel good. They then took a particular rat and then put wires into the rat's brain and showed that a rat figured out that it could make itself feel good by pressing a lever. It would then bang on the lever up to 2,000 times an hour. So apparently it worked. But in 1970, another scientist said, all right, let's see if it works on a person, and turn them from a homosexual into a heterosexual. So B19, we don't know who he really was, had this electrode thing put into his brain, and he controlled the amounts of stimulation in experimental sections. So the young man was reporting increased motivations through this, when especially the scientist allowed B19 to self-stimulate. It was kind of like letting a chocoholic loose in a candy shop, and he became so obsessed with it that in one 3-hour session he pressed it 1,500 times until he was experiencing such an overwhelming euphoria he had to be disconnected. Now, at this stage, his libido was so jacked that he went on to the final stage of the experiment, where he was exposed to a willing female partner. Remember, he was homosexual, and only allowed the pleasure button when looking or at her or being with her. And according to him, eventually it led to a successful sexual encounter between the two, proving that you can ungay somebody by electric shock treatment.
You don't want to get chopped anymore.
All I'm saying is this is what he reported. It was a apparently willing experiment. Apparently. But I'm kind of dubious about it.
He gave consent. He doesn't want to be gay anymore.
That they could do the experiment at least. However,
Yeah, no, it sounds like a money laundering thing.
well, the problem was, and the bit that makes me deeply suspicious, is after the success, nobody ever heard of B19 again.
No, because it was a money laundering thing.
Probably. Now, we mentioned we would talk about the living severed heads. So here's the thing. In the French Revolution, the big invention was the guillotine. And as we very much know, it was in a very, very, very efficient way of executing the nobility. And of course, it was used a lot even after the French Revolution because of its effectiveness as an execution method. And it was said by a great many people that once the head was severed, it was seen to move, and one wondered if the head at least was still alive, separate from the body. Well, Soviet physician Sergei Brukhonenko decided that he wanted the answer. So he developed a primitive version of the heart-lung machine, which he called an autojector. And with this device, he succeeded in keeping the severed head of a dog alive for up to a month.
Wow.
He displayed one of his living dog heads in 1928 to international group of scientists at the Third Congress of Physiologists in the USSR. And to prove that the head was alive, he proved that it reacted to stimuli. He banged a hammer on the table and it flinched. He shone a light in its eyes and it blinked. He gave it a piece of cheese, which it ate, but then popped out the back of the esophagus because there was no body. It became the talk of Europe. And George Bernard Shaw said, it might be great to be a head because you would never have to worry about dressing and eating and anything else. And still carry on. However, they didn't last very long, as you can imagine. So, yep, that has led in the modern age, for those who can't actually manage to afford full body cryogenics, and for those of you who don't know, cryogenics is where we basically freeze you in a special chamber in the hopes that 100 years from now they will have a cure for whatever ails you, and we will be able to unfreeze you and cure you, and you can carry on living. But one of the popular things, if you can't actually... Yes.
On that same topic, what do you think about mummies? Why did they mummify people?
We are coming to mummies because, in a sense, it's the same thing. So you can get just your head cryogenically frozen. Now, of course, one of the problems with freezing is cell expansion and rupture. Apparently, if you do cryogenics right, and how would you know? I'm not entirely sure. Maybe doctors can tell, but a normal person can't. It's frozen so fast and so cold that you don't get cell rupture, which means that when you unfreeze, you would be fine. Theoretically. Now, it might mean, because quite a lot of people have had cryogenic freezing, and there are both bodies and heads stored away, maybe one day we can create a semi-robot-human hybrid, and they will get back and going. Who knows? These things are being looked into. Now, in terms of your question, there was almost a primitive method behind mummification that follows the same idea as cryogenesis. The idea, though, was not for this life, but so you would have a decent and functional body in the afterlife. So it was preserved for the next world, which they believed was just like this world, but better, if you could get there, and that you needed a decent body in the next world. So absolutely, that was the point of mummification. The idea of keeping your body in good order for the next chance you get to live.
Okay. So is that like scripted on
Yes. it is within the Book of the Dead that they did it deliberately so you can have a good body for the next life.
Okay. So they didn't try and mummify someone so they can try and bring them back alive.
No.
Because
That aspect actually, apparently, I'm not entirely certain, correct me if I'm wrong, but from all the research I've done, actually came from Europe after the discovery of the mummies. And it was more a sort of a horror fiction idea that if you disturb the tombs, they will get up and come and sort you out. And that developed in horror stories and fiction. But it wasn't the original purpose, apparently. But now here's a question, and this does touch on things we've discussed in the past. Now, there seems to be indication that there isn't a single human race, but that there are multiple. The main...
first of all, that they all died out.
No, that's the interesting thing. Not necessarily. So you've heard of the Denisovians. You've heard of the Homo floresiensis. We've discussed both on the channel. There are other possible ones. We know that there was the Neanderthal, Homo erectus, and there's a couple of others, I forget them all now. Now, the key thing is that they are genetically compatible. And that's ultimately how we got to Homo sapiens. Because the different groups are genetically compatible and can breed. So you create a single group, eventually over centuries, from more than one origin. So instead of you're having a situation where you start with a single and you branch out and then they keep branching out, in real life, compatible species branch out and come back and cross over and go out, and that does happen. We have as many breeds of dogs as we have, literally because they are compatible. But that said, you can't cross a dog with a dolphin. They are not genetically compatible. But what kinds of things are compatible? Well, we know that Neanderthals are compatible with Homo erectus because DNA shows that they did get together.
Well, you can probably be compatible with anything. Because if you look at force mutation, okay, why in nature, how does force mutation work in nature? Because we all kept on mutating. We mutated from a single cell until we are now.
Well,
And if you put something in really hard conditions, it seems like life always strives.
you're partly correct, at least, according to scientists. Personally, I think you're right. However, according to scientists, you can, within your genome type, so theoretically, a dolphin and an orca, because they're kind of the same genetic type. But a dolphin and a shark, no, because they're not the same genetic type, right? But here's the thing. What is the closest genetic type to a human?
Currently.
Chimpanzee
Yeah,
and
I was
ape.
Apes and chimpanzees.
Yes. So
Because
here's where scientists again shouldn't have been allowed
Yeah, I remember those stories.
because they have for decades been in the Soviet saying that they are trying to create a human-ape hybrid, breeding chimpanzees with humans. And it's been confirmed that they were trying. The question is, did they succeed? Now, it began with a study of veterinary reproductive biology, and the idea initially was, can you breed fatter cows, cows that will give more milk, etc., which absolutely you can, and we have. But this scientist, Dr. Ivanov,
The prices on bulls, wow.
right,
When you want to breed, when you hire some
absolutely.
bull,
I
big
literally,
muscular bull.
I know somebody who has a farm, and they don't farm more than about 20 animals. But they really are important because they've got that bull. And you will pay cockloads
Yeah,
to
people
have
pay
that.
millions to have that bull
Absolutely.
children.
Now, that's what you would call forced evolution through genetic breeding. We interbreed things to get them faster, stronger, bigger, better. We do it with horse racing. Absolutely. You want to get one of the top racers to cover your mare, you're going to fork out big time. I mean, thousands and thousands. So absolutely, we do it. Now, the Russians, this particular doctor, wanted to try to interbreed a man and an ape in 1927, and he went to Africa to try it. Now, thankfully, his efforts did not succeed, partly
What do you say,
made...
thankfully?
Do you really want one of those things created?
For experimental reasons, yes. But if it's dangerous, no, then wipe it out. But we need to learn, study. We need to know these things. Is it possible or not? I'm okay for letting the science happen.
Well,
You might
he
say,
was
no, but
most...
it's not ethical. I don't care about ethics. Just do the
Okay.
science. It's very important.
He felt the same, apparently, because he managed to have 2 unsuccessful attempts to inseminate a female chimpanzee with human sperm. But he was found out by the rest of the staff, and they stopped him. And he had to return to the Soviet Union, but he went back with an orangutan, which is apparently even closer than a chimpanzee to a human, genetically speaking.
Orangutans are smart.
Unfortunately, the orangutan he had was male. So back home, he asked for female volunteers. And remarkably, he got a few takers.
Really? Okay. I don't
Unfortunately,
think somebody would consent to that.
Unfortunately, he was found out yet again. He was sent to a prison camp for a couple of years, which ended his research. However, it is suspected that his experiments have been continued, though nothing has been proved. So, throwing it out there. Now, here's an even creepier one, which I don't know on whom the experiment really was being done. In 1924, Connie Landis, a graduate student in psychology from Minnesota, devised an experimental study to see whether emotions invoke characteristic facial expressions. is there one expression that no matter who you are will convey shock, happiness, interest, whatever? And his subjects were fellow graduate students. And he painted lines on the faces of his test subjects so he can see where the muscles moved, and then exposed them to a variety of stimuli designed to provoke strong psychological reaction. And he took photos of their faces. He made them smell ammonia, look at pornography, reach their hand into a bucket of slimy frogs, and at the climax of the experiment, forced them to decapitate a live rat. Most people resisted his requests, but 2/3 actually did as they were told, which fits to the experiment that we discussed earlier. 65% of people will do as they're told no matter what. Most of them performed the task quite clumsily in an effort to hurry the difficult job. 1/3 totally refused, and he did it for them. And it did prove quite a lot, and in fact that at least in human beings, and to a certain degree in apes even, facial expressions are common. So there you go. The next interesting one, which was truly, is just gross, was an attempt to prove that yellow fever isn't, in fact, contagious. And he did it by covering himself with human filth of varying varieties, including the vomit from a yellow fever patient, and proving he didn't get sick, not even if he had open cuts on himself. The problem was that actually the way it's contagious is blood to blood. So if somebody has yellow fever and gets stung by a mosquito and then it comes and stings you, that's how you get it. So he was going about it wrong, which is why he didn't get sick. And he declared himself proven right, but he was actually wrong. And later on, he died of it. Irony. Now, what about beneficial brainwashing? Now, we've seen some fairly awful negative brainwashing. What if I could manage in some way to cure you of a psychological issue basically by brainwashing you? There are
Isn't that what psychology is?
To a certain degree, yes, but how far can you go? I mean, I can use psychology to help you get over minor issues and traumas, but what if you were a complete schizophrenic? It's a fair point. I mean, if you could actually cure
Well,
a
you
schizophrenic...
can get schizophrenic through brainwashing.
Possibly. So, they say that you listen to audio messages looped over and over for days or even weeks, and it pushes your psyche to alternate thinking. So, beneficial brainwashing. And a number of his patients became his unwitting test subjects. He was a doctor at a clinic. Whether or not they actually had schizophrenia. Some checked in, said they had menopausal related anxiety, etc., etc. Little things that, a couple of weeks you sort it out and great. Only to find themselves sedated with barbiturates, which are not good for you, we now know, strapped to a bed and forced to listen to days on end to messages like, "You are confident in yourself." which he said it will fix you, it will take you and put you on a better thinking level. Now, to prove his theory, one of his messages were, when you see a piece of paper, you will pick it up. He then took them out of the hospital to a local gymnasium, and in the middle of the floor was a single piece of paper. Almost everybody walked over and picked it up without being told, proving, he said, that it worked. Now, when the CIA learnt of what he was doing, they were like, we see possibilities in this for other reasons. So they started secretly giving him money. But eventually they decided that his technique was in fact a failure and stopped giving it. By the 1970s, a large group of his former patients filed a suit against the CIA for its support of his work and sued them, and they settled out of court. Then comes the next interesting one. Now, we've spoken of Demikov and his two-headed dogs. However, the Americans decided to top this. Yes, top this. And what they did, with funding from the government, is they cut the head off two monkeys and swapped them around, reattaching it to the new body. When the monkey woke and found that its body had been switched for a new one, apparently the monkey was extremely angry. It survived a day and a half before succumbing to complications from surgery. But it could have been worse, apparently, because it was noted from a surgical point of view, it would have been easier to put the monkey's head on backwards. Now, he thought that he would be treated like a hero, but apparently the public were appalled at what he did. And when he tried to get support for testing a human head transplant, and touring with a quadriplegic, Craig Vitovitz, who volunteered to be his first one, they went all over to try and get help from this, but didn't get it. Just throwing it out there. You may be glad of this. What about a remote-controlled animal?
Well, if you look at, I'm not sure if you did any research with the neurochip, but they started experimenting first on pigs.
Yes, they did.
And they were able to control the pig's body movements, like lifting up his legs and stuff like that. So he wasn't completely remote controlled, but they could control some of his limbs by stimulating his brain.
Well, Jose Delgado from Yale went to Cordova, Spain, and he had done something to a large bull that was very angry and put in a bull ring. And he went and stood in the bull ring. The bull, pissed off and doing what bulls do, charged. When the bull did the charge, he pressed a remote-controlled unit in his hand, sending a signal to a chip in the bull's brain, and it stopped dead and then just walked away, docile.
Oh, wow.
So apparently he was able to at least stimulate behavior, a remote-controlled chip to make even a very angry animal docile. Now, if you think about what Spooky just said and about the possibility of, we've spoken of in past lives, of chips in people, this literally means I could take a criminal, for example, who is violent and dangerous, and force them to be docile. And
Well,
anybody
the neurochip
else?
has lots of applications because the neurochip can solve many brain problems as well.
As well. So there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. But how do we know who will do what and who has control of it?
Yes, you don't want somebody to hack you if you have a chip.
Right. But now these experiments actually happened in 1963. Right that far back. But electronic sensory brain experiments, or ESB as they seem to call it, stimulation of the brain, is now being done on rats, pigeons, pigs, and sharks. And as we know, humans. Well, what might be possible and how? Now, how many people have grown up with The Jungle Book?
I can't
Rudyard
remember.
Kipling?
It sounds very familiar, but I can't remember the story.
Mowgli, the little boy that lives in the forest with the wolves, Arkela, the head of the wolves, Bagheera the panther, Baloo the bear. Famous story by Rudyard Kipling. And of course, it was based on what apparently was a true story of a child raised by animals in the forest. Whether or not that's really true, what if? We also have Tarzan, the child raised by apes. Great stories. So what would happen if an animal was raised by humans, but not as an animal, as a human? Would it act like a human? So in 1931, a chap called Kellogg brought a 7-month-old female chimpanzee named Gua into his home. He and his wife proceeded to raise her as if it were a young human, treating her exactly the same as they treated their 10-month-old son, Donald. Gua and Donald played together, they were fed together, and as the Kellogg's subjected them both to regular tests to track their development, they were treated exactly the same. Now, one test was the suspended cookie test, which the Kellogg's timed how long it would take for their children to figure out a way to reach a cookie suspended by a string in the middle of the room. Now, Gua regularly performed better than Donald, but in terms of language acquisition, she was a disappointment. She didn't learn to speak the way Donald did. Weirdly, though, it also seemed to become a case that Donald was acting more like the chimpanzee, and he also struggled to learn to speak, and he couldn't manage any better than Gua. When he one day indicated he was hungry by imitating Gua's food bark, they realized that he was growing up more like a chimpanzee than the chimpanzee was like him, and they terminated the experiment and got Donald human friends. So yeah, that is kind of weird, and you do it to your own children. I don't know.
Wow.
Now, in 1942, Professor Lawrence Leshan in New York had a row of young boys in a cabin sleeping, and he's standing in the dark saying over and over and over, not waking them, My fingernails taste bitter. My fingernails taste bitter. Now, what he was doing was conducting a sleep learning experiment. They were all diagnosed as chronic nail biters. And what he was doing was trying to see if he could cure them of the bad habit. Now, he used a phonograph initially to play the message, and it repeated the phrase 300 times a night. 5 weeks into the experiment, the phonograph broke, so he took over saying it. By the end of the summer, 40% of the kids had kicked the habit. And sleep learning, it seems, does work. Now, other researchers also did experiments in this. 1956 in Santa Monica College, they did the same exact thing to see if they could make people learn while sleeping. And there is a certain amount of truth. It's not that effective. However, I will tell you that when I was studying for my final degree, there was so much to learn that I would read my notes aloud and record them and then play them back when I went to sleep. And it helped. It did help.
Yeah.
It's not perfect and it's not fully effective, but it helps with memory.
Okay.
So there you go. Next up, Frankenstein. Mary Shelley. Who, this is a quick quiz for you, who was Frankenstein?
Are you asking? Who are you asking?
I'm asking Mickey and you.
I don't know.
He's a stitched up person. He's a bunch of body
No!
parts.
No! Everybody
Frankenstein's
gets that wrong. Mary Shelley wrote the book Frankenstein. Frankenstein was the doctor.
Yeah.
The monster was not Frankenstein. He was Frankenstein's monster. However, the question is, could you do that? Could you actually do that? Now, in 1780, the Italian anatomy professor Luigi Galvani, from whom we get galvanism, which we still use to this day in other fields, managed to cause the limbs of a dead frog to twitch by sending electricity through them. Soon, people of science throughout Europe repeated his experiment. But they got bored with frogs, and they then started wondering, what about other animals? And eventually, what about people? Now, eventually, the nephew of Galvani, Giovanni Aldini, went on a tour of Europe in which he offered audience a chance to actually see what happens when you use the galvanic experiment on a genuine human body. And he put 120 volts through the executed murderer, George Foster. He placed the wires on the mouth and ear, and the jaw muscles moved. The features twisted in a rictus of pain. The left eye opened as if to look at people. As a final grand finale, Aldini hooked one wire to the ear and plunged the other up the, do apologize for this, up the rectum. Rectum, it killed him. And the corpse broke out into a dance, as if the wretched man was being restored to life. Now, in reality, while it stimulated the muscles, it didn't restore them to life. But we do know that it was the basis for what we use in medicine today whereby we use electroshock to restart a stopped heart. And if you can catch the person before true death sets in, you can do it. So there's an element of truth to Frankenstein. And of course, this was one of the main sources of inspiration for Mary Shelley's story, Frankenstein, in 1816. Now, here's the thing. There's all kinds of questions and a lot of rubbish answers as well. What exactly is it like to be a cat? How do they see the world and see us? What if you could look through your pet's eyes? Well, in 1999, a number of researchers led by Dr. Yang Dan from the University of California, Berkeley, an assistant professor of neurobiology, anesthetized a cat with sodium pentothal, of all things, chemically paralyzed it with Norcuron, and secured it in a surgical frame. They glued metal posts to the whites of its eyes and forced it to look at a screen that showed scene after scene of swaying trees and turtleneck-wearing men. Why? Well, they wanted to see how the brain worked and to see through the cat's eyes. They inserted fiber optics into the vision processing center of the cat's brain, and it measured the electrical activity of the brain cells, transmitted this information to a computer which decoded the information and transformed it back into a visual image. The cat watched the trees and of the person. The same images emerged on the computer, a little blurred, but nevertheless what they actually were looking up. So it seems that you can see what the animal sees if you can find a way to remote check it. And you could actually go and see what your cat gets up to, where it goes, who it looks at, and all the rest of it. Now, they reckon they can do better, but I've got to be honest, should they? I don't know. It's a bit creepy. Well, can you stimulate sexual behavior in turkeys? Well, apparently, male turkeys are not fussy. As long as you give them a lifelike model of a female, they don't care. Good enough. It's true as well for a number of animals, by and large. So what is the minimum required to excite a turkey? And so they removed parts from the model turkey one by one until the male turkey lost interest. Tails, feet and wings were all removed, but the male bird was quite happy. Eventually they were left with a model head on a stick, and still the turkey was quite happy and in fact preferred the head on a stick over the body. So it seems that in terms of turkeys, it will settle on anything, and if it can't find a female turkey, a plain stick will do. Why? Yeah, I don't know, but there you are, the things scientists get up to. Now, here's an interesting thing. This is a psychological test that was conducted in 1978. So you're a young guy, you're wandering around the campus of Florida State University, an incredibly beautiful female comes over to you and says, "I noticed you around campus, you're attractive. Would you go to bed with me tonight?" Now, would you say yes? Well, this was an experiment conducted by psychologist Russell Clark. He persuaded the students of his social psychology class to help him and to find out which gender in a real-life situation is more receptive to a sexual offer from a stranger. Would the men or the women be more likely to go yes to a proposition? Now, the results were, sorry, Spooky, predictable. 75% of guys were like, sure. Whereas those that said no were usually like an excuse of, I'm married, I'm gay, or whatever. However,
They were meant to spread their seeds.
However, not a single woman accepted the identical offer of an attractive male, and most of them demanded that the guy fuck off.
Yeah.
Somehow that wasn't really an experiment, was it? I mean, we knew that was going to happen. Why did they need to do it? Now, here's a thing that apparently is a step up on an experiment we've already done. And here's the interesting part, which maybe does tell you a lot more about humans. As you know, we had an experiment where people who thought they were conducting the experiment were in fact the subjects, giving an electric shock to a person. And 65% went all the way up to what they believed was termination. So they did the same experimentation with a puppy. And weirdly enough, less people want to hurt the puppy. Apparently, we like puppies more than humans.
Because the puppy can't give consent.
And they're cute. Now, they then went on to see if they could train a puppy with electric shock therapy. And as you may or may not know, you do get shock collars, even today, that you can put on a puppy to teach it not to pee on a carpet or whatever, increasing pain in order to motivate the puppy to learn quickly. And this was started with an obedience experiment that was done on animals first, but then on people as well, entirely to see if I can train you to do things. Can I make you into a certain kind of personality type? Can I make you have certain habits using pain therapy? Now, the interesting thing is that at least when they did it on the puppy, less so on the person, they openly wept, refused to do it, and there were very, very few that carried on pressing the shock button. Fortunately, it wasn't really done on the puppy. It was only thought to be done. But really, that's just horrible.
Yeah.
Now, here's an interesting one. 1938, John Deering put in his electric chair, had a black hood placed over his head, and had the electrodes attached. He was a volunteer in an experiment, having his heartbeat recorded as he was shot through the test by firing squad. Yeah. So prison physician Dr. Stephen Besley figured that since Deering was going to be executed anyway, science should benefit from the event. So the electrocardiogram disclosed that despite Deering's calm exterior and that he agreed to do it, his heart was really beating fast, 120 beats a minute. The sheriff gave the order to fire. It raced up to 180 beats per minute. He was then shot, knocking him back in the chair. One bullet went through the right side of his heart, and for 4 seconds the heart spasmed, and then slowly stopped beating over 15.4 seconds after the first shot. The next day, essentially, they had proved that even if people say they're not scared, they are when they know they're about to die.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, why? But I guess people are people. Now, let's move on to something even more weird. Because after all, I mean, why do we do what we do if not for the weird? Ta-da! And we are going on to, well, can you make a zombie? Can you turn something into gold? Can you build a living mini brain with eyes? Yes, you can. So, first up, August of 2021, a group of scientists made news that was both fascinating and horrifying when they announced they had successfully lab-grown a tiny human brain with its own pair of eyes. It's called an organoid, and it's grown from stem cells in a neural tissue, stimulating the cells with chemical signals to form tiny rudimentary optic cups fitted with light-sensitive cells. Thankfully for our collective sanity and for the mini-brains themselves, the organoids don't have nearly enough neural density to be conscious. So they're not asking how they ended up an eyeball in a dish. But they were sufficiently developed to see, which may mean I could grow eyeballs to cure retinal disorders and even blindness. But come on, guys, really? Well,
I have heard of people growing ears on the back of mice before.
oh, we're getting to that one. Yes, you can. Now, that's very, very important. And the reason it's important is ordinarily mice are not a genetic match for humans, which means anything from a mouse will not be a genetically viable thing for us. So it's not just the growing of the ear. It's the fact that they've managed to make a genetic match between mouse and person.
Yeah.
So that the tissue will be accepted. But we are getting there. Now, the next interesting thing is proof that crows are so smart they understand the concept of zero, which was only actually developed by human societies around the 5th century AD and requires abstract thinking, which therefore proves that crows can do abstract thinking. They are that intelligent. So it means that crow brains are a lot more clever than you think. So yeah, it seems you can. But it now one of the problems is, what is the line between human and animal? Because we've proved that the great apes are nearly as intelligent, in some cases almost a match. Dolphins are nearly as intelligent, at least. Crows might be. Does this mean that there isn't a division between human and animal?
there's a division between human and human.
Well, that's another story, and a dangerous one to get into for all kinds of reasons, but you have a point. Now, for centuries, alchemists wanted to create the philosopher's stone, a mythical substance that could transmute lead into gold. Can you do it? Well, it seems that for a few seconds you can, turning water into gold using sodium and potassium, where the extra metals in those things get transferred to the water, rendering it metallic. The briefly metallic water might give us key insights into how quantum mechanics works on an atomic level, and so that you can actually create natural elements. Now, why is that important? I can turn lead into gold. Absolutely can. The only problem is it's done through radioactive treatment, which means the gold will not be actually touchable for the next, 15 million years, which is obviously renders it useless, okay? But if you could find a way to do it naturally without the radioactivity, you could create gold and possibly other things. Can you? Not yet. But it's cool to think of. Now, this then leads to the experiment where they created a time crystal. So researchers working with Google, of course, created a time crystal inside the tech giant's quantum computer. The crystal was a completely new phase of matter, and claimed it was able to evade the second law of thermodynamics, which indicates that entropy, or the disorder of a system, must always increase. Unlike other systems, which see their entropy increase over time, Brownian motion and all of that, the crystal's entropy did not increase, no matter how many times it was pulsed with a laser. And this means that you've created a static temporal crystal which has weird quantum mechanics, which might be the way that you could possibly somehow overcome the space-time continuum problem for interstellar travel. Maybe, eventually. But not yet. So, what about zombies? Now, here's the thing. If you found a zombie, would you wake it up? And why? Well, apparently, if you're a scientist, the answer is, hell yes, of course I will. Why wouldn't you wake up a zombie? So, these zombies were strange little creatures that were found in the permafrost in the Siberian snow from the Pleistocene. They were found, cloned, and brought back to life. Luckily, they're not your World War Z zombies shambling around and trying to beat people, but they are tiny little biocelluloid rotifers, little multicellular organisms. They produce asexually, not through being an actual animal type thing, but thawed, these creatures did start reproducing using parthenogenesis, creating perfect clones of themselves, even though they had been frozen for 24,000 years. And they had survived, putting themselves into a protective stasis called cryptobiosis. Now, if they can figure out how they did it, Then they want to try and put it into human beings so that humans can do it too. Yeah, I kind of feel that they should be stopped. But don't worry, the next one's even worse. So, a study published in, I believe, 2024 July, okay, was connected to an older but even more weird study. So, the Finnish scientist Ika Hanski introduced the butterfly, a particular kind, won't matter which, onto the remote island of Sotunga, planning to study how the population of one species placed outside in a harsh habitat will survive. The butterflies harbored a species of stomach-bursting parasitic wasps, and those wasps carried their own smaller stomach-bursting hyperparasites, itself a parasitic wasp. Once the butterflies were released, the wasps erupted, spreading across the island with their host. This provided scientists with further study not only of how the butterflies survived and the wasp, but also that if you mess with ecology, it does not end well, because soon it wiped out most of the island with stomach-bursting parasites.
Right.
Yes. Don't do this at home, kids. Yeah, just don't do this at home, kids. Let's leave it at that. But that said, we have yet more to talk about. We have spoken of a number of the big ones. We've still got quite a few more, so we'll have to carry on tomorrow with exactly how far human beings have gone in ways that they really, really, really should not have. So, yeah. What do you think so far? Are scientists the kind of people that you don't want left lying around in case they do stuff?
Very interesting.
It's kind of terrifying, but it does get worse. Don't worry. The human experiments shall continue. But for tonight, we're kind of there for now. So if you've lasted this long and haven't run in horror, we will go on for more later in tomorrow's live. But until then, thank you so much for being a part. Thank you for joining. Thank you to you two for being on the live. It's been pretty damn cool. And if you can come up with some fairly awful questions, please do so. I think it will be good for us all to hear your thoughts after you've had a chance to ruminate. I know Spooky can come up with some good ones, and I know Mickey comes up with some awesome ones. So, yes, if you didn't know, she looks innocent, but she was the initial start of this creepy one. So,
You didn't really drop any names for the scientist names.
there were a few, not too many, but if you want names for who did them, certain people ordered the experiments more than just the scientists that went to do them. So we know, for example, all of the Nazi experiments were under the aegis of Himmler and Goebbels, especially Goebbels, who was known as the Poison Dwarf. So some of them were literally official government departments, like the US Department of Health, that ordered them.
No, I can imagine it would be governments would be involved with these types of experiments.
Absolutely. And we know that even in the case of some of the wackier ones that really shouldn't have been let out their cage, the governments quickly got on board and funded them.
What I really wanted to ask you is, Darwin ever done any weird experiments?
I'm going to find out. I don't believe so. I do know that he deliberately didn't do certain experiments for reasons, one of which caused the near extinction of an animal species, where he didn't take back home the giant tortoises to show their length of life and everything. And he didn't experiment on them for the simple reason that they were too tasty. So, I don't know if that's better or worse. We know that no tests were ever done on the dodo because they got eaten before. But there is a set of experiments which we are going to get to, where using specialized genetics and DNA sequencing, they are trying to bring back the dodo.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I've heard a couple of things. They also want to try and bring a mammoth back using elephant DNA.
they have. They have successfully done that.
Right.
Yes, they have. We have to get to that. You must remind me. So, yes. But it then implies what other things might we bring back and why? I mean,
I
we've
would
watched...
imagine just for the fun of it.
Well,
Just for science.
you've seen Jurassic Park and how well that went.
Yeah.
I mean, doesn't that warn you?
Seems like fun. Yeah, it could turn out to be very dangerous, and then the dinosaurs can rule the game.
It could be. Who knows? They do say that the most likely end of the human race will be caused by the human race. So,
Most likely, it's our biggest threat is humans.
I think it's a very reasonable comment. But nevertheless, with all of that said, let's stop it here. There is much more to be done. And we will do it in the next one. So I invite everybody to join us again tomorrow. I certainly invite both of you to join me tomorrow. And bring questions, comments, ideas, and let's see how weird we can really make this.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Have a great one. It's been awesome.
Cool.
Thank
Good
you so
night.
much.
Good night, good night, good night, Mickey. Have an awesome one.
Yeah.
And I will chat to you later.